In the previous videos, we've gone through the journal entries for the buyer in a merchandising transaction and for the seller in the merchandising transaction. Now I want to show you just a couple quick tips that you can add to your checklist of ways to check your work. First of all, anytime the buyer credits accounts payable, the seller should debit accounts receivable. Anytime the seller credits accounts receivable, the buyer should debit accounts receivable. If you think about it, these are two sides of the same transaction. The seller should always think that the amount owed by the buyer is exactly what the buyer thinks they need to pay. Otherwise, you've got a problem. So always make sure if you're debiting accounts receivable for the seller, you're crediting accounts payable for the buyer. If you're debiting accounts payable for the buyer, you're crediting accounts receivable for the seller. That's why I like to keep these T accounts going, because I can always check to make sure that my balances are the same, and they are. The second thing that you should always remember is that on the buyer side, every time they get something off their bill, they book the exact same entry. If they return something because they don't like the color, they debit accounts payable and credit inventory. If they return something that's defective, they debit accounts payable, they credit inventory. If they get an allowance on their bill, so someone knocks part of the bill off, they debit accounts payable and they credit inventory. So from the buyer's perspective, it does not matter why the goods are being returned. It's the exact same journal entry. Debit accounts payable, credit inventory. Anytime they return inventory or they get some sort of a discount on their bill. From the seller's perspective, the reason the first journal entry is always the same. So regardless of why goods are being returned or if we give an allowance, we're always going to debit sales returns and allowances and credit accounts receivable. That part's always the same. But the second entry is going to change. If the buyer returns goods that we can put back into inventory and resell to someone else, we debit inventory, credit cost of goods sold. If the buyer returns goods because they're defective and we cannot sell them to someone else, we debit loss of defective goods and credit COGS. Finally, if we just give them an allowance, they don't return anything, we just give them something off their bill, then we don't have a second entry. We don't impact inventory, loss, cost of goods sold. None of that's impacted. We only have the first part of the first journal entry. Okay, and then the final check is when you book the journal entries to actually settle the bill, when cash is exchanged, the amount that the buyer sends has to equal the amount that the seller receives. If you think about it, I'm the buyer, I'm paying for my stuff, I write out a check, I put it in an envelope, seal it, send it off. What are the chances that the amount on that check is going to somehow change overnight in the mail before it gets delivered to the seller? Unless you have a really, really dodgy mail carrier, chances are it's the exact same amount. So always make sure when you're doing both sides of the transaction for the buyer and the seller that the amount of cash that the buyer credits is the exact same as the amount of cash that the seller debits. All right, a couple quick tips for checking your work, and I'm going to leave you to it. All right, see you next time.